Welcome to Climate Breakdown, I'm James Lamont, and today's topic, all downhill from here. In the world of climate activism, large-scale good news can be hard to come by. So when it emerged in the early months of the coronavirus pandemic that global greenhouse gas emissions were down 17% relative to the previous year due to a dramatic reduction in transportation use and general economic slowdown, a silver lining seemed to be presenting itself through a cloud of CO2 tons and deadly viral particulates. It was also projected at the time that due to lockdown measures being eased, emissions would likely only be down about 7% by year's end. Well, the numbers are in, and the analysts were right in their predictions. According to figures from the Global Carbon Project, carbon dioxide emissions in 2020 fell 2.4 gigatons, that's billions, down 7% to a level less seen around a decade ago, a total of 34 gigatons. In the US, EU, and UK, the fall from 2019 was approximately 12%. Carbon pollution from land transport was down by a tenth, and from planes by almost half. This is the biggest drop in industrial history, with the previous record holder for a modern economic wipeout, the late 2000s Great Recession, causing barely a 1% drop in global emissions. What does it say about conventional economic commitments that this reduction in lethal pollution only seems to happen when things go off the rails? These numbers may provide you with an ironically cold comfort on a warming planet. Nevertheless, keeping it real remains paramount. Even if we were able to put aside all of the misery that the COVID disaster has so far wrought, mass suffering and death of a similar nature to that which the climate movement hopes to avert, there is no guarantee that this historical discrepancy will result in the continuation of reductions of any kind, let alone the more rapid cuts that will be necessary to prevent a runaway warming scenario. In fact, as ever, the deck is stacked in favor of a failure. In 2010, when the economy began to recover towards so-called normalcy, emissions rose over 5%, negating the previous drop in stunning fashion. We can see evidence that this is already happening again with the increase in pollution following the end of the initial wave of lockdowns. In October, the International Energy Agency published its annual World Energy Outlook, using data to examine a number of possible futures. While the IEA has been heavily critiqued by many actors over the years for the way that it interprets data, their reports do offer a lot of insight into what is happening with energy use around the world. One of its scenarios this time around is the delayed recovery scenario, under which there is an extended economic crisis throughout the 2020s and emissions remain largely flat. That might sound better than the direction that we've been headed, but it's definitely not enough to decrease the buildup of gases in the atmosphere. When looked at alongside the Outlook's still rather conservative Sustainable Development scenario and the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, where emissions by 2030 have been cut 20% and 41% respectively relative to 2019, it's clear that recessions are blunt instruments when compared to active measures to reduce our overall footprint. There is serious disagreement as to whether even the most ambitious of these net zero goals, 2050, is remotely adequate to stave off a complete environmental collapse. But at least under these projections, the peak is firmly behind us. Government planners have access to plenty of advice from stodgy, unintimidating establishment bodies on how to make this happen if they so choose. In June, the IEA partnered with that unwavering pillar of the Washington Consensus, the International Monetary Fund, to produce a sustainable recovery plan, specifically detailing short-term actions to ensure that 2019 remains the year the corner was turned. There is no excuse for annual emissions to rise ever again. The public seem to understand that the 2020 pollution dip is not all that it appears to be. A report published earlier this month in a major peer-reviewed scientific journal, that's the US-based Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, suggests that concern over climate breakdown has not diminished due to the pandemic. A survey of almost 2,000 people in the UK was conducted in April 2019 and again in June 2020, consisting of a series of questions on the severity of climate change. Between the two time periods, there were tiny variations in the responses, but nothing consequential. These results cast doubt on the previously studied concept of a finite pool of worry, the idea that when a new crisis comes along, semi-abstract ones like climate get pushed out of public consciousness. At the time of the second survey, the UK had been in its first COVID lockdown for 3 months, and news of the pandemic-inspired emissions drop had been reported widely. Neither of these facts seems to have caused a downturn in climate worry. A further question in the second round of the study asked which of the two issues was a bigger concern, coming out at almost exactly the same level for their effects on the UK. When participants were asked which was a bigger issue for the world, however, climate came out ahead with a massive 22-point percentage lead over coronavirus. In addition, the team also analysed over 120 million UK tweets over the time period and found a drop in the number of climate-related ones as the pandemic ramped up, suggesting that even when people aren't talking about it as much, they're still concerned. Another study conducted in April of 2020 found a similar phenomenon in levels of concern over climate in the United States. As the COVID crisis seems to go from bad to worse in places like the US and UK, and the outlook for 2021 is almost anyone's guess, it'll be interesting to see if these findings hold true. But it appears reasonable to suggest that public understanding of climate breakdown is at this point robust enough to withstand it falling lower in the headlines and discourse, and that the average person understands the difference between the superficially positive side effects of a new crisis and an active significant transition. The biosphere is breaking. The public, despite many of the problems, is increasingly desiring action. Government should honour not only those concerns, but all of the people that we lost in the past year by seizing this moment to avert further suffering on an even larger scale. Climate Breakdown Podcast will be watching them to let you know if they do.